Okay, well, good morning to all of you. It is great to be together. I am grateful that we can take this time to gather, and I'm especially grateful to Dean Jim Turrell for joining us to talk about the liturgies of Holy Week, how to enact the liturgies of the Triduum in different contexts. So we're going to jump right into it because I have a strong feeling that we have a lot of good content that we are going to get to hear. But before we jump right into it, I'd like to open us with a prayer. As we are beginning to put our minds at the start of Holy Week, I'm going to offer this collect for the Sunday of the Passion. God be with you. Let us pray. Almighty and ever-living God, in your tender love for the human race, you sent your Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ, to take upon him our nature and to suffer death upon the cross, giving us the example of his great humility. Mercifully grant that we may walk in the way of his suffering and also share in his resurrection. Through Jesus Christ, our Lord, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. Okay. Jim, I don't really think I need to do much introduction because I think you know everyone here on this screen.
I think I've taught the majority of them and have met just about everybody else. But yeah, no, so it's just a delight to be with you all. And to talk about Holy Week, which is my favorite part of the year. And then there's one liturgy that, of course, is the most excellent liturgy of all time. And we'll talk about that on the back end of the week. But part of the burden of Holy Week is it's, as you all know, a lot of liturgy packed into a very short period of time, each with its own sort of variations on a theme. In the case of something like Palm Sunday or Maundy Thursday, right, where there's basically a core outline of the Eucharist, but with different bits added in. And then you get to Good Friday and the Easter Vigil, and it's a whole different liturgical structure than we're used to. Or in the case of the Easter Vigil, it encompasses two familiar liturgical structures, the baptism and the Eucharist, but it's so big and all-encompassing. So it really is a sort of different kind of burden in terms of planning and thinking ahead. It's not like the Sunday morning that we've all had where we've been at the hospital the night before, or there's some other pastoral crisis we've been dealing with the day before, but we know when we get there on Sunday, if we can get there, we can rely on muscle memory to carry us through. And that's the other part, is that it's a year between iterations, right? Or give or take a few weeks, depending on when the first Sunday after the first full moon after the vernal equinox falls, or whatever your golden number is that year, right? So all of that is to say, it's wonderful to talk about Holy Week with a bunch of folks and to know that the big season is coming up, right? And Holy Week, actually, if you look at the front of the prayer book in the lists of feasts and seasons of the church year, they actually single out Holy Week as separate from Lent, and it really is a sort of different creature. You go to some places and they sort of think about it as just a subset of Lent, but it really is its own sort of thing with a history that's separate from the history of Lent. And really the history of the Holy Week rites also shows kind of a two-stage development. The Easter Vigil is the oldest liturgical form that we have out of the rites of Holy Week. And then the other bits seem to have sprung up, as best we can tell, influenced by the practice of Christians going to Jerusalem on pilgrimage. The best record, of course, is Egeria's travel diary from 384. A Spanish pilgrim who goes to Jerusalem records everything that she's seeing and experiencing, leaving this as a record for us, except, and most annoyingly, when she gets to the Easter Vigil, she says, and they do the vigil the same way that we do back home, right? Which doesn't really help the historian, right? So we know that the vigil was something that pre-existed Holy Week. We know that Egeria and others are breathlessly reporting about the other Holy Week rites when they get home or when they write home in the 4th century. And that itself kind of hints at a sort of hierarchy within Holy Week that I think most of us know intuitively, which is the vigil is really the pinnacle, the climax of the week. And everything else is sort of moving us through a narrative and moving us towards the vigil. But if you're going to invest your resources and your time and your energy, and you have finite resources and finite time and finite energy, as most of us do, you probably want to prioritize the vigil in your planning. And then you might sort of work backwards through the week. But the vigil would seem to be the culmination of the week for all of us. I can't help but note that when I started teaching here in 2002, 2003, and I had to ask the seniors in the pastoral liturgy course to raise your hand if you came from a parish where they did the Easter Vigil, there'd be just a few hands going up. And after the 10-year mark, I stopped asking because around about 10 years in, so 2011, 2012, 2013, almost every hand in the room would go up. And so it was interesting to sort of see a transition, at least, given Sewanee's sort of main catchment area in that period of time, that in the Southeast, the vigil had kind of taken root. The other thing just to note in passing, the vigil is really the culmination, not Easter Sunday morning. And there's this delicate negotiation that you have to engage with sometimes with folks in the parish, in the altar guild or in the choir, the folks who are really invested in worship planning, to make sure that the vigil gets due attention and is not pushed aside in favor of the decorations or the music or whatever for Sunday morning. One of the things that was an observable phenomenon here at All Saints when I first got here was that it was a volunteer choir out of the university choir on Saturday night for the Easter Vigil, but everyone was expected to be there on Sunday morning, which is actually the precise opposite of the way it should be. Now, there is St. Gregory of Nyssa in San Francisco, wonderful folks who for years have just hung a sign on the door on Easter Sunday morning saying, "So sorry you missed it. We did Easter last night. See you next week." Most of us can't get away with that. Tempting though it is in terms of making a point, right? And actually, in some ways, you miss an opportunity from the standpoint of evangelism, because if there's any cultural pressure to go to church at all, it's Christmas and New Year's. If you have folks showing up who don't kind of understand the whole texture of Holy Week and why the vigil is a big deal, you don't want to let on that they're getting, the lesser observance on Easter Sunday morning. And you need to do the rites, do your Eucharist, do it with integrity, do it with vigor on Easter Sunday morning. But it's still true that the main event is the vigil the night before. Speaking of All Saints, there's another burden that we kind of inflict on students here, because we do think it's important for folks to go through the Triduum, through Maundy, Thursday, Good Friday, and the Easter Vigil together as a community for spiritual reasons, for reasons of worship and formation. But it can sometimes create an expectation that if you cannot do the vigil on the scale that they do at a place like All Saints Chapel here, then you shouldn't do it. That's faulty logic. You can do the vigil with just a handful of folks. One of the most moving vigils that I ever took part in was at a place I was filling in. It was a house church. They'd had all kinds of sort of stressors and trials and tribulations, including a tornado that finally took out the house that was the house church. So they were meeting in borrowed Church of Christ space in West Wilson County in Mount Juliet, up outside of Nashville. And it was sort of like the last faithful remnant. There was literally a dozen folks on a Sunday morning. Well, 10 of them showed up for the Easter Vigil, and we did the Easter Vigil sitting in a room in the Church of Christ, handing the scripture around. Each of the grown-ups took a share in the readings. It was the antithesis of the kind of big grand production value kind of Easter Vigil, and it was at the same time a vigil with integrity. It was incredibly moving. It was just resetting the sort of expectations for the performance, and engaging with the core of the rite. And so we'll talk about the core of each of these rites as we move through. If you're in a smaller church, and I know some folks are, there's a great guidebook for the ceremonies of Lent, Holy Week, Easter, and the Great 50 Days by Lee Mitchell that's out from Cowley Publications, still in print. He has a section for each of the liturgies of Holy Week talking about how to do it in a small congregation. And so it's useful both for the sort of exhortation not to be intimidated by the rites if you're in a family-sized parish, but it also has practical tips for the sorts of things to do. One last sort of global observation about Holy Week is that we're kind of straddling this line between anamnesis or anamnesis, depending on your Greek teacher, and mimesis, right? So anamnesis, you're calling a past event into the present, making it real for the participants. It's a rich kind of remembering. And mimesis is like play acting, okay? And the liturgies sort of move closer to that mimetic piece than, say, the Eucharist does on a typical Sunday. But we still don't want to quite fully tip over into mimesis. What am I talking about? There's a custom in parts of the Mediterranean world for you to, on Good Friday, enact the walk of Jesus to Golgotha by beating yourself with a whip. The flagellantes of Spain and southern Italy, that's mimesis. Or they're actually in wrote down the name of the province in the Philippines, Pampanga, on the island of Luzon, where people actually crucify themselves on Good Friday. So it's an imaginative entering into the acts of Good Friday, but that's mimesis, and we're stopping short of that. Now, for most of us culturally, we're not going to be tempted to crucify ourselves. That kind of Mediterranean world or Spanish Catholicism inflected bit is not necessarily going to speak to us in the same way, most of us. But what can speak to us is the tendency to play Good Friday as God's funeral, forgetting that we know how the story is going to turn out, right? So anamnesis, we remember these events, we engage with them seriously, they are real for us, but we know the larger arc of the week, and we know the larger arc of the gospel, right? And so we know how it turns out. So we have our own maudlin tendencies, those of us who are, Anglo or West or Northern European. We're not that far off from the folks on Luzon if we give in to that tendency to forget that we know the story arc, we know the narrative arc. Let's walk through the individual liturgies of the week, and I'm mindful we want to have some time for conversation on the back end, so I'll try to move myself along. We start with Palm Sunday, and Palm Sunday is really about tension and contrast. There is that Palm liturgy that opens the day, and then you very quickly move into a liturgy that's focused on the Passion, right? So you gather in a place apart, you bless palms. Side note, it's better to actually have the palms in a pile and bless them instead of handing them out separately and having people just hold them up while you extend hands from a distance. Typically, when we bless things like, say, bread and wine at the Eucharist, we do it with the stuff in front of us, and then we distribute it. When you pass the palms out first, because it's more convenient, if we extended that logic, we'd go for those individual shot glasses of grape juice that are sealed with the wafer with another foil sealing over top. We'd hand those out at the door as people came in, and just have everybody lift their shot glass at the appropriate words in the Eucharistic prayer, right? And we don't do that. So go ahead and bless the palms, make a fuss over the palms visibly, and then hand them out it won't take that much longer. If you have a large congregation, you can have a bunch of folks help pass them out, get the ushers, the acolytes, and so forth involved. If you have a small congregation, it's easy enough to hand them out to the 10 or dozen people in Mount Juliet, right, or wherever you are. You do need to be in a place apart for a procession to actually work. You have to spend some time in motion. Think about what would be a distance that would let you sing a chunk of All Glory, Laud, and Honor, which is one of the few times you have a hymn specifically named in the prayer book rubrics, right? And the other piece in here is working on heightening that contrast between the Palm liturgy and what happens as soon as you get inside the church, right? So there's provision for a station collect. To make it a formal procession, you have to stop someplace and pray. That station collect you might well do at the church door. You could do it at a place along the way. Once you get inside the church, you're really shifting the mood away from singing hosannas and all glory, laud, and honor to a focus on the passion. So everything in the staging, for lack of a better term, in the music needs to be mindful of that sort of break point or hinge point between those two parts of the liturgy. There are some places that are sort of troubled by the contrast, by the triumphal entry, and then the shift to the passion narrative. They don't like tension and contrast. You can't really fix that for folks within the bounds of the approved liturgy. There are places that have substituted the Palm Gospel as the gospel of the day, and they either won't do the passion narrative at all, or they read it as a sort of ersatz last gospel in the pre-Vatican II Mass, when you would kneel or genuflect and they'd read the prologue to John at the end of Mass. Again, that's not a sort of approved liturgical form. What that is doing really is ignoring, honestly, the history of the rite, because we know from as early as the 3rd and 4th century that they were reading the Passion narrative on the Sunday before Easter. This isn't sort of a recent convenience because we're afraid people won't show up at church on Good Friday. That pattern continued through the Middle Ages, where the Sunday prior was where the gospel for the Passion would be read. And actually that dissonance, that tension is creative in some ways and important, I think, because if we're the ones singing all glory, laud, and honor and celebrating the entry, and then if we are in a place where we read the Passion narrative in parts and have the congregation take the part of the crowd, we can instill in folks the sense, on some level, whether conscious or subconscious, that we are the ones, we humans are the ones who turned on Jesus, who went from singing at the triumphal entry to shouting, "Crucify him." When you read the synoptics on Palm Sunday, you don't have the full bore troubling bits that you get in the NRSV and RSV translations of John's Gospels, where it is, quote, "the Jews," close quote, who killed Jesus, right? The synoptics don't use that troubling turn of phrase. They're not in the same context that John's in. But getting the congregation reading the part of the crowd in the Passion narrative on Palm Sunday further diffuses that issue, that tendency that we all have to want to blame somebody else for what we as humans did, right? It defeats the othering of the people who crucified Jesus. We take that part. So I would say it's important to have the dissonance of the Palm entry, or the triumphal entry rather, in the Palm liturgy and the Passion narrative, and to engage the congregation in the part of the crowd in the Passion narrative to drive home that point. At the same time, if you have folks who are troubled by that tension, you can preach about it, you can talk about it from the pulpit, you can teach about it outside of the liturgy as well. I think the tendency is understandable to want to focus on the palms and not the passion. We don't do tension well sometimes, and in our secular culture, there's a tendency to want to say, I'm okay, you're okay. And what the church is really saying is, I'm not okay, you're not okay, none of us are okay, right? And Palm Sunday with the Passion brings all of that into sharp focus. As we move through Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday of Holy Week, there's not official prescribed liturgies in the prayer book for those days. What you would typically do, because those are regarded as major holy days, is observe the Eucharist each day and use the lectionary readings. The lectionary readings move us closer and closer to Good Friday in that process. So there's no special liturgical form. What you would do is typically have just a simple Eucharist, keep the tone somber and move folks forward. You do find in some places the custom of using tenebrae out of the Book of Occasional Services on Wednesday night. Tenebrae anciently was lauds and matins for monastic communities at the second half of Holy Week. And we only have the Wednesday readings supplied in the BOS because we really don't want Maundy Thursday and Good Friday to have any rivals for our attention. If you do tenebrae, that would typically be done in a place where you have the resources to do everything else in Holy Week really, really well. You don't want to take on tenebrae, which is honestly, it's a beast in terms of the length of the service, the number of readings, what would be required of a choir. If you're reading tenebrae, it can be sort of long and tedious, which if you're a monastic is kind of the point, right? Daily officium, daily work. It's not supposed to be enjoyable. But in a lot of congregations, Maundy Thursday, Good Friday, Easter Vigil will require enough resources and enough energy that I would sort of say you add tenebrae sort of last of all of the liturgies to take on. Maundy Thursday is really where we move into the great 3 days, and this is the 3 days that folks in the field have referred to as one liturgy spread over 3 acts, or one liturgy over 3 days. So if you sort of are minded to look at the details, there's no dismissal at the end of the Maundy Thursday reading, liturgy rather, or at the end of the Good Friday liturgy. Most people in the pews will not experience them as a single liturgy because the tone is so different. But it is nevertheless a way for us as clergy to think in mind of, we're really moving through 3 parts of one arc, one narrative arc. There's 2 elements on Maundy Thursday, and both are important. Homiletically, you typically choose which one you're going to focus on, the first Eucharist or the foot washing. And the epistle picks up the Eucharistic theme. The gospel, John's gospel, picks up the foot washing. Notoriously, John gets you right up to the start of dinner and then skips to the end without telling you what happened during dinner. So we have to go to Paul for that. It's not a Eucharistic festival. There's a custom in some parishes left over from the revival of Holy Week rites before the 1979 prayer book of focusing on the institution of the Eucharist and wearing white and ringing bells and singing the Gloria and kind of making it a festive, ersatz Corpus Christi liturgy. Probably not helpful. The better advice is to stay in Holy Week mode, so red vesture, continue on doing Trisagion or Kyrie. If you're in a place where the custom is to silence the bells for Lent, keep them silenced, that kind of thing. The foot washing is, of course, optional, but more and more you do see it done. There were attempts to enculturate the foot washing for folks who are unaccustomed to taking their shoes off in public. One example was a bishop and a couple of priests in the Church of England who went down to the train station to polish shoes. That, I guess, can work. It's a little less of an intimate gesture than foot washing. Probably the one that would have unintended symbolic consequences was the parish were the parishes that decided to do hand washing. Now, there is hand washing that takes place in the narrative of Holy Week, but it's Pontius Pilate, and it's probably not someone we want to imitate. So as sort of strange and anachronistic as it is to non-Mennonites, we probably want to stick with the foot washing in Maundy Thursday and not get creative there. We revised the BOS version of how to do foot washing in the last Book of Occasional Services to suggest that it works best if people getting their feet washed then in turn wash the next folks' feet coming forward. So the clergy kind of start the washing and then get out of the way and let others wash, instead of the practice that had been going for some time of the clergy washing everyone's feet or washing a representative sample of feet. It's not really a clericalist thing. Jesus didn't say just to the priests, go and wash feet. He said, if you want to be my follower, right? If you want to be my disciple, you need to do this. And so giving the congregation a chance to wash others, I think, is a helpful adjustment in the most recent version of the BOS. If you're going to do that, you probably need multiple seats and multiple basins, and some either acolytes or sacristans or altar guild folks attending to the need to supply pitchers of water to take full basins out and to swap towels when they become saturated, if you have a big congregation. Maundy Thursday in a small congregation is actually really beautiful, and has some of the intimacy that foot washing and the Johannine narrative of the Last Supper actually kind of conveys, or I shouldn't say of the Last Supper because he doesn't talk about the supper part, but the last night, right? So what the rest of us are trying to create in a big congregation through the foot washing is naturally present when you do Maundy Thursday in a small congregation. Stripping the altars is a sort of later evolution in the rite. It does not have to be done if you're going to do it. This is one where you don't want to over symbolize or symbolicize, I guess, what you're doing with the rite. Make it a straightforward functional thing, and don't get too terribly fussy about it. Be expeditious. You've got a psalm that can cover the action, but eventually you're going to run out of psalm if you take too long. So you need to be reasonably efficient there. Good Friday, you start with the church looking very different than it did before. And so if you don't strip the altar in the public liturgy at Maundy Thursday, you need to make sure that things get cleared out. And the emphasis visually on Good Friday is on the starkness of the space. When Will was, I guess he would have been almost 3, he and Jenny came into the nave at All Saints on Good Friday, and he sees it dark, no artificial light, just the sunlight coming in, and all the hangings are stripped out and everything. And he of course had fallen asleep during the Maundy Thursday liturgy, as kids do, but he didn't see the stripping process. But he walks in and he said audibly, "Uh-oh," which is kind of what you're looking for in the way that the space looks on Good Friday. That kind of, okay, this is different kind of moment for folks. Kids might verbalize it out loud, but you want adults to feel it too. The core of Good Friday is the reading of the Passion and the praying of the solemn collects. And if you look at the liturgical form, actually all of the sort of typical embellishments on the liturgy are kind of stripped down. So it's a fairly stark liturgy if you do it straight. Later, they added to the Good Friday rite the veneration of the cross and then communion from the reserved sacrament. There is nothing wrong with either of those, but you do not want them to steal focus from the proclamation of the Passion and the praying of the solemn collects. So the old adage, keep the main thing would apply here. The rubrics in the right are a sort of flow chart. If you're going to do communion from the reserved sacrament, 79 anticipates that you will do the veneration of the cross. So you wouldn't sort of skip the veneration and move to communion if you're following the flow chart of the rubrics. And then I alluded to it earlier, John's gospel is the passion narrative this day, not the synoptics. And that can be somewhat problematic, right? Because of the way that it refers to in the Greek, what is typically translated as the Jews, translated in the RSV and NRSV that way. The context of John, of course, explains why, because John is written after the Christians have been in his community expelled from the synagogue. And so it's when the church and rabbinic Judaism are pulling apart. You can get an interpretation, if you know that context, that is not anti-Semitic. But the problem is that the folks who show up in the pews don't know that context. Right. So you have to figure out how you want to supply some of that context. If you're going to use RSV or NRSV, one option is to name it in the sermon, to deal with it. You probably want to deal with it briefly because it's not a sermon about Christian-Jewish relations, right? Or you can put a note in the bulletin, or you can do both, right? The problem with doing it in the sermon is you can't really devote enough time to the problem. The problem with a note in the bulletin is not everyone's going to read it, right? There was an observation that somebody made during the course of the hearings for General Convention this last time out, talking about this, that said basically, if you're going to preach on this on Good Friday, it better not be the only time you're preaching on these issues, right? So you can take time elsewhere in the church year to deal with these issues a little more directly. The other thing, though, to bear in mind is that there are other approved translations that you can use that do not say the Jews to name the folks that John is painting as the bad guys in the narrative. So the Common English Bible would be an option. The Contemporary English version would be an option. You can find other options that will speak either of the Judeans or will speak of the religious authorities or the Jewish authorities. Those are somewhat less problematic than using the straight up RSV, NRSV translation without the context. So consider supplying the context, consider how you're going to supply the context, or consider whether you might use a different translation for the passion narrative that time, right? Doesn't mean you have to use that other translation at all the other liturgies of the week or even of the year, right? But just consider what you might want to use on that particular day. Solemn collects, this is one place where there's a custom in some places of doing the holy calisthenics, as I've heard them referred to, right, where you stand your bid to prayer, you kneel for silent prayer, you stand up for the collect, and then you hear the bidding, your bid to kneel again, kneel for silent prayer, stand up, pray the collect, and lather, rinse, repeat. That is a good way of making sure that the silence between the bidding and the collect is a long, chunky silence, which is really kind of crucial for this to work. A collect is, of course, the presider summing up the silent prayers of the assembly. And so the way you do this solemn collects, if you have a deacon or in the absence of a deacon, an assisting minister can bid the congregation to prayer, but the prayer is actually happening in the silence. And then the presider just puts a period on the sentence by saying the collect out loud. So doing the stand for the bidding, kneel for silent prayer, arise for the collect enforces a lengthy silence, right? Or else you really do look like you're doing calisthenics, which is not edifying, right? Other places you're going to kneel for the whole thing, and that is just fine. You just want to make sure you make that silence nice and long. There is a story of Marion Hatchett, who taught here years ago, being asked by a priest who was an STM student how long the priest should make the silence. And Marion thought for a moment and said, long enough for 3 Our Fathers, 3 Lord's Prayers. But then they were doing it, and the silence seemed so short, and Marion couldn't figure out why and what had gotten lost in the conversation. And then he looked and realized he saw the guy's lips moving, and he was saying, "Our Father, our Father, our Father, our Father, our Father, our Father." And so, maybe 3 Lord's Prayers is a bit long, but 2 is not too long, right? And certainly 1 would be the bare minimum. So give yourself a decent chunk of silence there. If you're doing the veneration, then you want to make sure the cross that gets brought in is big enough. Doesn't have to be crucifixion sized, but it has to be big enough to read in your space and to be a symbolically weighty object, especially if folks are going to observe in your community the custom of creeping to the cross, of actually coming up to the cross and venerating it. It's a little bit like the amount of water you use in baptism. If your water sits in a little custard cup inside a font, like it did in the parish where I grew up, and you're suddenly praying this prayer that talks about, the waters of creation and the Red Sea and the deliverance of God's people at the Red Sea, and you're looking down at about 2 ounces of water, it's hard not to start to grin inappropriately during that prayer over the water. In the same way, if you're venerating an object that sits about, 10 inches or 12 inches tall, there's an absurdity that creeps in. So get a decent sized cross. If you have to get somebody in the parish to get some 2x4s or 2x6s, even a lousy carpenter like me can make a cross out of that. So get something decent sized if you're going to do it. Reserved sacrament, there's sort of sketchy directions, but they tell you everything that you need to do. And your space will dictate some of the staging, but the things to bear in mind are, the Eucharist has already been done, so you're bringing over stuff that's already been consecrated, been set aside for a holy use. There is no fraction. The fraction happened last night. This is really just a very functional distribution. And in some places, they will expect you to do communion from the reserved sacrament. In other places, if you tried to bring it in, they'd look at you like you were crazy because it just wasn't part of their religious vocabulary to do communion from the reserved sacrament on Good Friday. And as we all know, you go into a community and you can shape the custom and tradition and culture in a place, but you can't dictate it. And so you just want to conform to wherever you are. Easter Vigil is the highlight. Holy Saturday, there is a brief liturgy for that. It's really brief. In a lot of places, it'll be what they use for anybody who's sort of doing preparations of the space for that night. In other places, it'll be a draw for some folks, but it'll always be a small crowd, a small congregation for that liturgy, and that's really okay. It's just waiting. It's biding time, keeping watch. And then the real event of Holy Saturday is that night. It's technically Easter Sunday because it's after sundown, and it's the Easter Vigil. The main thing here is you're working with natural symbols, right, for the first part of that liturgy, natural symbols of light and dark. So there's a rubric that says the liturgy happens after sundown on Holy Saturday and before sunrise on Easter Sunday. Sunset is technically when the sun crosses the plane of the horizon, right? When it drops below the horizon. There's still a lot of light after sunset. So you want to work after civil twilight. Civil twilight ends, and that's when you can no longer see outside with the light left over from the setting sun, right? And you can go online and there's different websites that'll tell you when civil twilight ends. But so in this part of the world, we typically would have the Easter Vigil starting at like 8 at night. There are places that do this early morning as the sort of Episcopal version of the Protestant sunrise service. The trick about that is that it is harder in many congregations for families to get up really, really early than it is for them to stay up just a bit later. And so you just sort of calibrate that to the expectations of your people in your community. If you can do it, it's really cool if you can time the point in the liturgy where you get to the Easter proclamation as the sun is coming up over the horizon. That requires some pretty careful planning and estimation of how long all the vigil readings will go, but it can be done. For your natural symbols of light and dark, if you do this liturgy after civil twilight ends, you have a great advantage in the kindling of the new fire and the lighting of the Paschal candle. I've seen pictures of the same fire at different times in the same congregation, or comparable fires in comparable congregations, and a fire that looks really sort of pathetic and does not make you think of the light of Christ being able to pierce any darkness at all, a couple hours later looks like it is the best bonfire that would put the Texas A&M to shame, right? So your time is going to help you with your symbolism of the fire. It is helpful to make a decent sized fire. And if you have Boy Scouts in your parish or in your community, there are typically folks there who will be more than happy to kindle a fire. As an ex-Boy Scout, I think I can say not inappropriately that there's just a tiny bit of pyromania in most Boy Scouts, and we are happy to use that for good and not ill. So make the fire, do the entry, do the readings. The readings are about hearing the entire narrative of salvation history from its greatest hits. Now, they give you 9 greatest hit options. You have to do Red Sea, of course, but the point of a vigil, right, is watchful waiting. It's keeping watch. So you probably want to have at least 4, and I would argue at least 5 out of the 9 readings, so that a span of time has passed. The Easter Vigil of all of the liturgies of the church here is the one where you can have a 2.5-hour liturgy, and if you do it reasonably well, no one will have looked at their watch at any point during it, right? Because you pull people into that almost trance-like state of being fully engaged and present in the moment, or it's that moment of flow that psychologists will talk about, right? Where you're in the moment and you're not sort of looking at your watch or worrying about what's coming up next. You're fully present. So I would say use 5 readings or more. Ideally, at the vigil, you have a baptism. One of the things that just hurts is when you see a congregation that does the renewal of the baptismal vows on Saturday night at the vigil and then has baptisms on Easter Sunday morning. Sometimes there's a concern about kids being able to stay up. But if you're baptizing infants, they'll often sack out during the Sunday Eucharist anyway. So it's more of a process of talking with parents and getting them over their concern or anxiety than it is an actual issue for the kid, who may sack out either way, whether it's Saturday night or Sunday morning. The other thing is getting folks comfortable with the idea that the liturgy may take a little bit longer than the canonical 60 minutes that we often have in our heads on Sunday mornings, and letting folks know that it's okay if they need to duck out for a little while and come back in. It's all right. If you go to an Eastern Orthodox church, folks are in and out, up and down all the time during the liturgy, and nobody thinks twice about it, right? So this is not Michelle Willie's kindergarten class over at Swanee Elementary. If you need to get out and then come back, it's really okay. And that goes for kids, but also for adults, right? And so getting folks to understand that, yeah, it's going to be a long liturgy, but it's okay if they need to attend to whatever needs. Typical notes on ceremonies for baptism: you want to use a lot of water, you want to use a lot of oil. See the reference to the custard cup above. You need your symbols at the Easter Vigil to really have some potency, some sign value, and that usually means making them big. Within the rite, you have the option of doing the gospel, of doing the baptisms after the gospel instead of in their natural position at the end of the vigil readings. You also have the option of doing the sermon after one of the vigil readings and not after the gospel. Both of those seem a little odd to me. There's a connection to the story of creation and to the story of the Red Sea if you baptize at the end of the vigil readings. There's also I think, need to preach on resurrection on this day of all days. And so better to juxtapose baptism with the last of the vigil readings that you're going to do, and then to juxtapose the sermon against the story of the resurrection. A couple of other things just along the way. You have the option of 3 different canticles to sing before the collect of the day when you get to the Eucharistic portion of the liturgy. Pascha Nostrum just really seems to me to be the obvious choice on the Easter Vigil of all days. And then you cannot skip the prayers of the people. That's still built in the flow chart. And again, nobody should be in a rush to get out. And so some of our own anxieties as presiders is sometimes the people will have been there for so long, but I've yet to meet anyone who went to the vigil who came out afterwards saying that was too long. They might say, wow, that was really long, as they look down at their watch at the end of the liturgy, but I've never seen them check their watch during the liturgy, and I've never heard them complain about the length afterwards. There are better ways to make up time during the liturgy. One of which, honestly, is in the sermon, because the Easter Vigil, and honestly, all of the rites of Holy Week are pretty much self-authenticating. If you do them straight as they are in the prayer book, the symbolism and the imagery in the text, they all work on folks. And you don't really have to add a lot. You don't have to explain a lot in the sermon. What you're really doing is sort of highlighting, and that's really about it. You're not doing the sort of didactic function or the explanatory function there. All of these can be done with small groups or with large groups. If you're in a place where you haven't done the vigil before, great way to get more folks to come is to recruit folks for different roles within it, and always recruit just one person from each family. So then hopefully they bring the rest of the family with them. It's the sort of thing where a small vigil can be just as meaningful as one that has a large turnout. A small Maundy Thursday can be just as meaningful as one that has a large turnout. Production values are not really the issue. I'm not sure that the National Cathedral did any of us favors by broadcasting so well during COVID, because it raised the sort of expectation and bar for everybody's live stream. Don't let what other folks do for Holy Week intimidate you out of taking these on. Doing the liturgy well just means giving it thought ahead of time, planning ahead of time, and recruiting folks to take parts in the liturgies. It doesn't mean how big your choir is or how complicated the anthem is or any of that stuff. Just think of the function of each day, and then think of that larger arc of the week, and your Holy Week will be beautiful and meaningful. So I've prattled on far too long, and I'm really curious about what questions folks have, or what folks are thinking of in their own contexts, if they're making changes or making adjustments, or how y'all are doing, as we have really a few weeks to plan, but we're getting closer.
Thank you so much, Jim. That was a lot of really wonderful and helpful information. And I wonder, please go ahead, unmute yourselves if you have a question and observation.
And one thing I forgot to say, the custom that I know from Lee, who used to go out to South Dakota, was in some Native American communities, the vigil goes all through the night with a fire burning through the night as the readings are read. And so you start at sundown and you end at sunrise, not necessarily with the whole congregation there the whole time, right? And people will come and go. But that's one that I've not quite been willing to try to take on here at the School of Theology, but it sounds like just an amazing experience.
Marie, please go ahead.
Oh, Ricardo had his hand up before me.
Oh, sorry, Ricardo. Yes.
Ladies first.
What a gentleman.
So I'm in a congregation that has an ASA of 50. Very small rural place. Juliana is familiar with this area. And they do not like the Easter Vigil. Just don't like it. because we have one service on Sundays. That's what everybody comes to. That's what we want. So what I did last year was I pulled the entrance from the vigil in to the Easter Sunday service, and then we sang the Exultet, and then we just went straight into the rest of the liturgy. Is that something that would be kosher with the prayer book gods, or, you know, all that?
So actually, if you look at the directions at the start of the rite for the Easter Vigil, down at the bottom, when the vigil is not celebrated, the service of light, which is the kindling of the new fire, the lighting of the Paschal candle, and the singing of the Exultet, may take place at a convenient time before the liturgy on Easter Day. So, I would just say you start then on page 285. So you do want to like burn something and light the candle from it. But then, you could do exactly what you described. What I would suggest is that that's a great sort of way to phase in the vigil a little bit, get folks used to that. And then maybe there's a handful of folks who would want to do the vigil. Who are your church nerds? And I say that with affection because I was one and still am one, right? But who are the folks who'd be kind of into it or interested in exploring it? Or, are there some folks out of the 50? And honestly, I mean, even if you just have a half a dozen people, including yourself, you could do a vigil with, do 4 readings, do the renewal of baptismal vows and the Eucharist in a small group. And it's really meaningful. We did, so during COVID, my family, the 3 of us, were out in our yard with the fire pit. And I mean, I feel a little guilt about this, right? Because not every family had a priest, but we were able to do and did the Easter Vigil, the 3 of us sitting outside around the fire pit. And then it got cold enough. We went inside, at the Easter acclamation, and did our own thing, the 3 of us. And part of what was moving about it was that we hadn't done the Eucharist. I mean, we hadn't felt like we ought to do the Eucharist when no one else could do it, through most of that period of lockdown. But it was a moving experience, just the 3 of us. You could do with a handful and then do Easter Sunday morning with everyone else. And then that handful might grow because it'll be cool and they'll talk about it with other people. And then, eventually you may have maybe not all 50, but maybe 15 or 20.
Thanks, Marie.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Ricardo.
My question kind of is in the same direction, Marie, because I have an older congregation who do not drive at night. So doing anything in the evening causes it causes one of 2 things: me running my bus, which drops everybody home, or they're not coming. Right. So it's a lot of doing it again Sunday morning, kind of, and you're right, because we plug into the cathedral. That has become our vigil, and then on Sunday morning we'll bring some of that with the light and everything into it. So you kind of, the thought of maybe doing something smaller or something combined with another church, might be a way around that.
Yeah, I think that is another thing. You can combine forces with another congregation. So it may be that it's a small group of your folks and a small group from a neighboring parish, and the couple parishes getting together could do the vigil. And the other thing would be, I mean, maybe in your context, maybe, if you want to do it on your own, you do it with that small group and you run the bus and see what works and what doesn't work. There is a difference for many folks driving at night at 8 as opposed to driving at night after like midnight mass on Christmas Eve. And what we've noticed, because we still do the Christmas Eve liturgy in the Chapel of the Apostles, right? So we're getting done. It's after dark when we're done, but it's not so late after dark. And so we get an older crowd that they're not going to go to Odie for the 10:30 service that gets done, right close to midnight. But they are comfortable enough doing ours at an earlier after dark. It's a little less dark. I don't know. So yeah, just sort of figuring out what folks' sort of comfort zone is, or what folks' tolerance level for an evening liturgy would be.
We're just about out of time. Are there any other questions? And if not, I wonder if any of you feel moved to share something that perhaps you are curious about or excited about this year, after hearing Jim share with us today. Yeah, Gary.
Yeah, I just had two quick questions. One was if Dean Turrell could repeat the translations for the Passion narrative that he.
Sure. So what I'm actually going to do, there is a, let me find it. I'm going to drop the story out of ENS that talked about this whole issue into the chat, because it gives even more of the context. So,
okay.
But the particular translations are the Contemporary English Version and the Common English Bible.
Okay.
So CEB, CEV, looks like the Good News Bible is also referred to in there.
All right.
So Common English Bible speaks of Jewish leaders, and CEV and Good News speak of the crowd or the people.
The second question I had was with the Good Friday liturgy, what your thoughts are about not doing it at noon, but doing it in the evening?
Yeah, so there's nothing that says you have to do noon or the 12 to 3. I mean, that's a sort of ancient custom, because those are the hours at which the crucifixion happened. I don't even have to answer in the hypothetical. I filled in for a year in Clarksville years and years and years ago. And that was a congregation that the church may have been in the downtown of Clarksville, but most folks in the congregation did not work downtown. So what I've experienced in places like All Saints, where it's a community that's literally built around the church, or what I experienced when I was working in downtown South Bend, where maybe our parishioners were not working right around, but there were plenty of offices and other workplaces right around us. So a noon liturgy would be right for the immediate environs. In Clarksville, that wouldn't have worked. So we did the liturgy in the evening, and we pretty much standardized on I think it was 7 p.m. for both Maundy Thursday and Good Friday, on the logic that gave folks who worked in Nashville time to get off at 5, fight their way through, I-24 traffic, maybe get home and get something to eat and then come to church, and so we were really working off that sort of premise that we pitched the time for Good Friday to serve the majority of the congregation. The one thing you don't want to do is do multiple proper liturgies on any of these days, right? You do the Maundy Thursday liturgy once, you do the Good Friday liturgy once. What you can do is do something like the Way of the Cross at an alternate time. So in South Bend, we did the Way of the Cross in the evening for anybody who didn't make the proper liturgy in the day. In Clarksville, we flipped it. And so there was a Way of the Cross at noon at stations around the church, to observe that hour for folks who felt that was important, but the main emphasis was on the evening. The Sewanee custom, where you got Way of the Cross leading directly into the proper liturgy of the day, it works here, but that's probably not one that I would imitate anywhere else, right? Instead, I would probably save out the Way of the Cross, if I'm going to do it at all, for an alternate time that would meet the needs of folks who can't come to the primary liturgy. And then I'd pick the time for the primary liturgy based on the majority of my folks, and use the Way of the Cross as the alternate.
Thank you.
Sure.
I just want to say I love this shoe shining idea, especially working with the homeless folks, and boots and all of that. So I think I'm definitely gonna use that this year.
What I might also encourage you to look at, I know they did this in Atlanta, and I think they did it up in Boston in the different congregations that work primarily with unhoused folks there. They actually had podiatrists, and I mean it was like a whole foot care thing, as opposed the shining of shoes was shining the shoes of commuters at the suburban rail station. And so what I would sort of encourage is maybe take that and riff on it in a different way.
I was thinking about shoelaces.
Yeah.
Like replacing, because those are things that everybody always gets used, shoes and boots, and they wear out so bad. So
and at the same time, if you wash the feet of a homeless person, that's a pretty powerful symbol of care, where handing them shoelaces. So I might juxtapose, do both, right? If you just give folks shoelaces, or these folks who were just polishing the shoes, that was sort of actually an avoidance in that suburban train station of the intimacy of handling somebody's foot, right? So I would say yes, and as opposed to instead.
Yeah, because we did the foot washing last year, and so I think this year adding to that would also help get more volunteers over there, more relationships.
Absolutely. The other thing, I'm always fond of dropping a line from Robert Havda into any conversation about stuff like this, and he was speaking about the Sunday Eucharist. But his line was to think that God works, to think that the Holy Spirit works only through spontaneous action is to give insufficient glory to God, which is just that sort of emphasis on planning and thinking ahead. The good thing is that Holy Week is complicated enough that we all know that we have to plan ahead for it, and nobody is likely to show up trying to wing it. Havda's point was about the Sunday Eucharist, but God rewards advanced planning at moments like this.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for taking an hour to spend. Thank you so much, Dean Turrell, for this time.
It's just wonderful to be with you all.
And y'all, I will share with you a recording, and I'm also going to make sure that I have the link that he shared about the readings, and I'll put that in the email in case you missed it. All right. Well, God's blessings to all of you.